Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're joining us today. My name is Scarlett Reynoso, and on behalf of Ethisphere, I am pleased to welcome you to the live webcast of World's Most Ethical Companies, a guide to applying in 2020. Over the next hour, you'll hear from my colleagues Michael Byrne, Douglas Allen, and Neil Thurston as they discuss changes to the 2020 Ethics Quotient, World's Most Ethical Companies application process, and more. If you have ever joined us for an Ethisphere webcast before, you know we love to take your questions and answer them throughout the presentation to make today's session more of a discussion with you. Please use the chat feature in the webcasting platform. Our goal for every webcast is to encourage you to ask any questions you may have. We are anticipating a handful of questions today, so we will try to answer as many as we can, and if we happen to run out of time, we will follow up with you via email. Following the live webcast, you will receive an email from us, including the recording of today's webcast and PowerPoint presentation, as well as a link where you'll be able to apply and the WME application guide. I will quickly introduce our speakers before diving into today's session. As I mentioned, we are joined by my colleagues at Ethisphere, Michael Byrne, Senior Vice President, Douglas Allen, Managing Director of Data and Services, and Neil Thurston, Director of Data and Services. Doug, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Scarlett, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to the many folks on the line from around the world, and welcome to the 2020 World's Most Ethical Companies process. We're extremely excited you all can join us today in the kicking off of, again, the 2020 process. For today's agenda, a quick run through of what we'll be discussing today. We'll run through quickly a little bit about Ethisphere as an organization and what the World's Most Ethical Companies process is. We'll touch on in detail on why you should be applying and sort of the benefits of doing so. We'll discuss the components of an application and how we approach the evaluation process here at Ethisphere. And we'll also quickly touch on the changes we've made to the 2020 year specifically. And for those folks who are devotees of the process, we'll give you a sense and glimpse of what's changed year over year, as well as some advice from the group in terms of how to get started and some common pitfalls that we see from applicants across the board. And we'll conclude with important dates as well. And of course, throughout today's presentation, we welcome your questions throughout. We'll be happy to take those as we receive them to the extent that we can. So please don't be bashful in terms of asking your questions throughout today's presentation. And regarding who is this presentation for, we've designed today's presentation specifically to be really for everyone. Whether you are a veteran to the application process, we'll touch on what's changed year over year, some important dates and pitfalls that we've learned from applicants this past year. This is for you. Also for the rookies who are brand new to the process but who are interested in applying, we'll discuss really what's evaluated, how to begin, and the best tips for getting started. And for those of you on the line who are simply curious in terms of what the process is, the benefits of that, this is also for you. So hopefully we designed this presentation to address everyone interested within the WME community and how to get involved and how to get started in the process itself. So a little bit about Ethisphere, for those of you who may not be familiar with us as an organization. Really, Ethisphere was created because we saw a need to really define what's good in terms of corporate behavior. Back when we were founded in 2006, there were a plethora of resources and tools to designate organizations who are not doing business the right way, but we saw a need in the marketplace to really step forward and define what's good in this space. The reason why we chose to do so is because we firmly believe good ethics is good business. Focusing on the long term, doing business with integrity, investing in communities, these are all components that result in sustainable businesses that really outperform. And how we do that, a few different tenets. We measure against standards, so codify leading programs and practices, and really set the bar with which other programs are measured against. We recognize excellence through WME and other vehicles, as we'll discuss today, and then of course, convening communities and inspiring advancement. So in a sense, we curate, convene, and collaborate practices and the value of shared responsibility and peer learning across our membership communities. So with that context in mind, I believe I'll turn it over to Michael, who can explain a little bit about the process for WME for 2020. So Michael.
Thanks, Doug. What is this program? Following up on what Doug was just talking about, back in the financial crisis, Ethisphere, with companies in the news, with all of the negative news that was swirling around corporate America, Ethisphere decided to try to celebrate what companies were doing right. Ethisphere began the world's most ethical companies list. Back then, it was more of a focus on really celebrating and recognizing what those companies were doing. I think it's evolved, and we're going to touch on this, but more recently, in the last at least 5 years, we're really making an effort not just to recognize companies that we think are doing business the right way or in an outstanding fashion. We also are making a real effort to share our information back with the participants. So we want this process, our focus has really been more on the companies that participate than just the companies that end up being included in our world's most ethical companies list. And we'll get into a lot more of that in detail. And then finally, we're constantly updating the process, and we're going to get into this as well. We have a methodology panel, we have internal expertise, and then we have conversations within the community, including those who have companies who have interacted with the regulators. So we are constantly talking to people and updating our process to reflect that. To get into why a company would apply, Doug, I'm having trouble advancing the screen. Let me see. Okay, why should you participate? Ethisphere, like I said, we've really been focused much more on getting value out of participating in the process than who gets included on our list or not. So we really see it as you learn through participating in the process. This begins just by reading the questionnaire. A lot of work and a lot of knowledge has gone into the questionnaire, and just reading it, you can learn what Ethisphere is thinking about, and maybe it gives you some different ways to look at your program or your company. Secondly, gathering the information to complete the questionnaire, you learn through that. You learn first by just learning what your company is doing. It causes you to go and talk to other functions. This is a questionnaire that you're not just going to be able to sit down in the ethics and compliance function and complete. You're going to need to reach out to other functions and get to know them. I've talked to people who said, I didn't even know some of these people, and I had to go ask questions, and I ended up learning more about the company, which in gathering the information, not only will you meet and get out kind of outside of the silo of your function, but you may learn things that your company is doing that you didn't realize. So it causes you to go and ask questions. Maybe you will learn that your company is not doing something that you thought the company was doing. You may assume HR is doing something, and then when you go and you really dig into it, that's just not the case. Or I think more positively, and I talk to companies all the time who say, I didn't realize we were doing this. I put it on my list of things to do, but then when I went and I talked to X function, it turns out they were already doing it. So I think just the process forces you to get outside of your function and to really go understand all that the company is doing. So just by filling out the questionnaire, I think you learn. And then finally, you learn, you benefit in the process from, we are sharing our information back with you. And we're going to get into a lot more detail on that. But so you learn from filling out the questionnaire, but then we're taking that data, and through a lot of different modalities, our efforts really have been focused over the last 5 years on how do we share that back to you so you can benchmark yourself against companies that we have included on our world's most ethical companies list, and really learn what other companies are doing and improve your program. Hang on one second. There's as Douglas said, Ethisphere, we really believe that if you do business in the right way, that it's good business. And we've included this chart to show that we have found a correlation between the companies that, as you go through those benchmarking processes, or as you use our data to improve your program, the companies that we're comparing you to, these are companies that are going through a pretty complete process. And their stock performance indicates there's a 14.4% premium over 5 years there's a correlation here between companies that we have determined are doing business in a certain way and their performance. Neil, do you want to jump in and discuss what it is we are evaluating?
Sure, that's great. So looking over the chart here, you see that there's essentially 5 sections that we're weighting with all of the material and the information that we gather back from the EQ process and from the WME process. In order to look at and evaluate the company's performance, we use all of these inputs we get from the EQ survey. And we've got to figure out how in the world do we evaluate this. So we created 5 weighted categories. The first one, and probably arguably the largest area, is the ethics and compliance program. All of the questions and areas that we ask you about that comes in at a weight of around 35% of the scoring that we do on this. Next up is the measurement of the ethical culture. By this, we generally mean where your organization takes a look at its focus groups, its surveys, any efforts that the organization takes in order to figure out where is our ethical culture, where is the perception, all of that, all of those efforts we give about 20% of weight to. With sustainability and corporate social responsibility, we're asking a number of questions to figure out what efforts your organization or your team is doing in order to promote, some sort of a healthy environment for, the community at large and within your own corporate or organizational structure. And we give that about 20% weight as well. As regards a section named corporate governance, we ask a lot of questions around how is your company structured at sort of the highest levels in that organization from the board or governing organization on down. We look at a lot of those responses and we give that about 15%. Finally, we have a section called leadership and reputation, where we're looking at what are your organization's leading practices, and also what is the reputation, the ethical reputation that your organization has at large, both within the community and within the larger community, and how does that look? We take about 10%. Part of that is a reputation search, which we will get into a little bit later. Overall, this is a very lengthy process. There's a lot of thought that goes into how these questions are put together and how these weightings are put together. It's fascinating to go through. We'll explain it a little bit more here in detail on the next couple of slides. Let's see, go forward. Thank you. So before we dig any deeper, I'm sure the question on everybody's mind is, how do I apply? How do I get started with this process? And yes, it is a bit of a lengthy process, but we've broken it down into 3 simple steps. Number 1 is completing the 2020 Ethics Quotient Questionnaire. There's a lot to unpack from that, but essentially that's the key first step, is looking into how do you get that questionnaire together and how do you complete that. The second part of that is gathering and submitting your supporting documentation. All of those bits and pieces, your policies, your written items, your videos, your flashy bits that you'd like us to see, all about your leading processes and your leading features about your organization, what makes you stand out, and gathering that as well. Number 3 is submitting the application processing fee. Every company who applies has to put together the processing fee for this whole process. As we're looking at it now, we have put a deadline on this. Gathering up all the materials, making sure you have the answers for the 2020 EQ questionnaire. We would like to have everybody's stuff in on or before Friday, November 8th, 2019 at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Get your calendar, make a little mark, do whatever it is you need to do in order to make sure you kind of have that drop dead deadline there. Ideally, you kind of want to get things in place before that. You don't want to be scrounging around on November 7th. And we will get to what the processing fees are and how the fee structure is coming up in a little bit. This is just sort of the overview of, these are the 3 big considerations you've got.
Hey, Neil, we had one question come in, or actually a slew of questions come in. One specifically touched on the order in which these materials need to be submitted. One key thing to point out is we ask that the questionnaire, the documentation, and fee are all provided on or before that November 8th date in any order you so choose. It's the important piece is hitting that deadline, but you're welcome to review the materials, complete the questionnaire, review the documentation components, all before submitting any fee as well. So we ask that everything's just submitted before that November 8th deadline in any order that you so choose.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think we can go on to the next slide. Yeah. Thank you so much. So the survey, it may sound a little daunting at first, especially for people who've never gone through it before. You out there who have completed it before, you're fairly familiar with the structure. It really hasn't changed all that much for 2020. We'll get into some of the details of the small things that have changed a little bit later in the presentation. But for now, we'll talk a little bit about what's contained in the current Ethics Quotient survey. In order to keep everything organized, we've split it out into 8 sections: the introduction, the organizational profile, the corporate governance section, the ethics and compliance program, which is arguably the largest section and the section which you'll probably spend the most time wandering around in and finding answers for. A section about third-party management, which is all about third-party business partners, citizenship, sustainability, and corporate responsibility in the 6th section. In the 7th section, about leadership and reputational items. 8th section is simply a general conclusion of the survey. I'll do a little bit of a quick breakdown. Essentially, the introduction is a very quick intro to the survey, some framework items that you'll need to know in order to complete the survey and figure out what's needed from you to complete the survey. Section 2, this organizational profile. It'll ask you a lot of establishing questions about what kind of organization you are and sort of very generally who is a contact point, and it'll require some names and some contact information out of you. The 3rd section about corporate governance will ask a ton of questions about your foundational board or governance structure, and a little bit about how that interacts with the company and with your ethics and compliance initiatives. The 4th section, again, arguably the largest, is your ethics and compliance program, which we've broken out into several different subsections. 4A, which we call Program Structure, Resources, and Oversight, is all about how you've set up your ethics and compliance program at your organization. What did you do to map it out? Who's involved? What do they typically do? Section 4B focuses on what we call due care, items around conflicts of interest and background checks. Section 4C is around your written standards, your policies, your procedures, your code of conduct, those governing documents that help you get through everyday business and give guidance to your employee set. Section D, ethics and compliance training, communications, and awareness. Here is where we ask a lot of questions around your training efforts and your communications efforts with your employee base set, and also your employees' awareness of the program, what you do to further awareness of your program. Subsection E, detection, monitoring, and auditing, looks at a lot of your efforts towards detecting misconduct, how you're monitoring for misconduct, and looking overall at some parts of your efforts within the organization. Section F is enforcement, discipline, and incentives. What are you doing in order to make sure that you're incentivizing the right kind of behavior and you're helping out with enforcement efforts when things do happen? Subsection G is about measuring your ethical culture, surveys, focus groups, those sort of items, looking at what kind of efforts is your team taking in order to get that through. Fifth, again, is third-party management, how you deal with outside business partners. Sixth, citizenship, sustainability, and corporate responsibility, where you're looking at efforts involving work within the community and work within sustainability or social responsibility inside the company as well as outside. Seventh is leadership. What are your leading efforts at making sure that you're a top kind of company within your own peer group or within the world? And a reputational item about your ethical reputation within the media and within the world at large. And 8, obviously, a conclusion. You have any questions coming up that I haven't seen so far?
So Neil, this is Michael. I wanted to just explain to people, we're seeing a lot of questions that are going to be addressed as we walk through this presentation. So if anything comes in that we're not going to be getting to, we will address the question. And then at the end, we'll circle back and see if there's anything we haven't hit. I mean, we're getting a lot of questions, but a lot of them go to, three slides into the future or something we're planning to address.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That sounds about right. All right, let's see. I believe this one is over to you, Doug.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you, Neil. So we had a chance to discuss the ethics quotient survey component of the application. Now we'll briefly touch on the documentation requirements as well. And I should state that, as Scarlett had mentioned at the outset, everyone on the line today will be receiving automatically a copy of our application guide materials for 2020. So for those of you on the fence or who are perhaps curious about the process overall, you'll have a chance to review the entirety of the documentation request guidelines and the survey prior to committing to apply for 2020. So while we'll talk about this today at a high level, you'll have a chance to peruse our materials in detail after today's conversation as well. So you can look for that fairly soon thereafter. So again, looking at the documentation, the purpose of the documentation step of the application process is really our team's chance to verify the questions or the answers provided amongst the questionnaire, and it's really a test to the quality of many of the underlying programs and practices identified throughout the survey. So it's not just an inventory of sort of the training and communications programs, for example, in place in your organization, but to what extent is this a high quality program? High quality training? Is it unique? Is it targeted? To what extent are our employees engaged in these interfaces? So it's our chance as a review team to get a sense of what these materials are. To get a sense of the scope behind the materials, we are asking for 33 items for 2020 across 10 categories. And again, all of this is spelled out in the documentation guidelines that will be provided to you as well. We made it, starting with last year's application, we made a concerted effort to really connect the underlying documentation requests to their underlying survey questions to provide some additional context and structure behind what we're trying to achieve through this evaluation part of the process. New for 2020, we've, for those of you who are familiar with the process, we've shifted documentation management providers to now Box, an enterprise Box account. So for those of you who are interfaced with us in the past, we hope to make it a much more engaging and smooth process for you in 2020. And so look for invitation and access to that later throughout the summer as well. We did receive a question earlier on about the confidentiality behind the documents that are provided. It's a phenomenal question. We understand that some of the materials that we do ask for, to the extent that they're available, they may be considered confidential or proprietary to your organization. We welcome you to redact those elements or components of the materials that you believe are sensitive. So please don't be shy in redacting areas as you see fit. We certainly understand the need to remain confidential and respect that need as well. So as you go through and compile materials for 2020, please keep in mind that we do welcome you to redact any areas you deem necessary as well. In terms of some broad guidance, really follow the guidelines closely. We've put together a pretty great document that specifies the how, the why, and the what behind the documentation we are requesting for 2020, and provides fairly detailed instruction on how to submit and process these as well as how to organize as well. So do keep a close eye on those guidelines. And of course, the team's available for questions. Our contact information is available both on the documentation guidelines and throughout the website and so on. So the team is available to get those questions answered in the event that you have concerns or some confusion regarding what we're trying to ask behind the documentation request.
Doug, this is Michael. I wanted to jump in. We've gotten a lot of questions about the confidentiality and how we treat information submitted to us and what we do with information submitted to us. To be very clear, and we spell this out in the questionnaire and in the process documents, we keep what you give us confidential. The responses to the questionnaire we keep, but we only use it in anonymized ways for benchmarking. So we can say, 75% of the companies are doing this. The documentation you submit to us, we keep confidential. We will keep all of this confidential, and we make it very clear in our documentation that we will. We also are willing to enter into an NDA. We have a form NDA that we would like to use, but we're happy to discuss that with you. If you are not selected for the list, we will never share that you participated in this process. Our goal is to celebrate companies. We don't want anyone ever to have a bad or negative impact from participating in this. So we're happy to discuss any type of confidentiality concerns. And then also, if there's certain documents, Doug had mentioned redactions. if there's certain documents we ask for that you're uncomfortable sharing with us, reach out to us so that we can discuss it. And first of all, make sure we're on the same page, that you understand what we're asking for. And then secondly, we might be able to discuss alternatives that you are more comfortable with, or some way that you can get us the information in a way that you're comfortable with. All right, so how are companies evaluated? We are taking something that I think is very subjective, which is ethics. And we are trying to apply as objective a process as possible. So the objective part of the process is we have our ethics quotient questionnaire, which Neil went through. A company fills that out, and they get an automatic score from how they fill out that questionnaire. But we don't believe that we can keep this completely objective, because we want to see not just what companies are doing, but how they're doing it. And so we ask for supporting documentation. We will look at the supporting documentation and we evaluate that and we score that. So let me give you an example. We will ask, do you have a policy or any type of guidance documents on let's say, anti-corruption? We list, there are a lot of risk areas that we ask about. We will give you a score based on how you answer the questionnaire. We will also go and look at that policy. So there will be some points that are allocated to the questionnaire. And then for that area, there will be some points based on what we think of that policy when we look at it. So the question, I'm making this up, but let's say it's a 50-point question, maybe 25 points go to how you answer it, and 25 points go to what we're seeing as the examples. And so as you go through the documentation guidance, we've tried to make very clear, we're looking for documents sufficient for us to get a feel for what you're doing with things like policies, communications, training. So if we ask for it and it exists, if we don't see it, you're going to be leaving points on the table, because there are points associated with everything that we are asking for. If it doesn't exist, then obviously it doesn't exist and you can't submit it. Then finally, and we've gotten some very specific questions about this, we do an adverse media search through Factiva is our database. I believe it's a Dow Jones company, but it aggregates news. We will look at public filings, Factiva, and then we will really go and look at wherever that research takes us. And what we're looking for is in the leadership reputation section that Neil discussed earlier, we give the company the opportunity to explain all of the positive recognitions and I guess positive impacts showing that they're a leader and showing that they have a good reputation. Unfortunately, the media is usually negative. So we go and we do our own review. This is hard because companies, any large company is going to have issues out there. And so we do our best to evaluate those issues. We will sometimes follow up with a company if an issue is confusing enough or significant enough. This section, normally, issues that we find, we will do a qualitative evaluation of them and try to really look in a reasonable fashion at the whole picture of what the company's doing and what the issue is. And it will affect the leadership reputation score. If there is something that's a really big challenge for the company, there are certain instances where something could on its own exclude a company from the list. So no matter what the score is, their overall score or performance is, because of this issue, they would be precluded from the list. If a company was going to be precluded from the list for that reason, we would reach out to the company to make sure that we fully understood the issue, to make sure that the company has a chance to explain their side of whatever is going on, because most often what's in the media is not the full story, at least as the company sees it. We generally look back 5 years. We've gotten some very specific questions about what we look for in terms of reputation review. We will go and look at if there's something that comes up, we will go and try to understand it. If it's a pending lawsuit, we will consider it, but until there's a settlement or some kind of resolution, we need to let the process play out. So if there are allegations against a company, we will look at those allegations and we will consider them. But generally, we are much more focused on when that lawsuit or the regulatory action is resolved and what the results of that are. Finally, so then we end up with a final score. And we take that final score and we look at it in context of similar types of companies. We would not expect to see the same ethics and compliance program from a non-highly regulated company as a regulated company. Companies that are not US-based are going to perform differently within our process than US-based companies. Private companies different than public companies. So we're really looking at how the company performs in the context of other similar types of companies so that we can select the companies that we think really stand out. And those are the companies that we include in our list. Hang on one second, I'm having trouble advancing. Okay, so what's changed for 2020? Companies that are on this call that have participated over the years will recognize that we made significant revisions last year. We heard the community when they said it was a lot. It was a lot of change. And so this year, we really focused on clarifying questions. Like I said, we talked to many applicant companies and we learn which questions cause confusion and which ones we can clarify. So we have clarified some of those questions, and that's where most of our effort went. This year, by popular demand, we are providing a red line of the changes. So you can see what the changes are year over year. And we added a couple new questions. To be sure, we have a host of potential new questions, but we've really decided to wait until next year to do another big revision. But we added a couple questions really getting at, one is getting at how managers are interacting with the report intake system. So how you're getting complaints or issues raised to a manager into the company's system so that you have visibility into them in the ethics and compliance function. And then we also added a question evaluating what companies are doing to support employees who are dealing with mental health issues. So what kind of mental health programs for employees? And that's beyond the kind of normal employee support programs. We've seen some companies doing some really interesting things, and we decided we'd like to learn more about that. The documentation requirements, what's changed there is substantially not very much. We have updated them to try to be more clear and more succinct. And there again, you're gonna see a red line. And then we asked for more supporting documentation about how organizations are following up with what they're learning through their culture evaluations and culture assessments.
Hey, Michael, we had a couple of questions come in. I'll try to tackle a few now. Again, I appreciate everyone's patience as we're dealing with a slew of questions from the group. So, Michael, we had a few individuals asked regarding the timing of which materials are considered. Is it within the calendar year? Is it before? Is it Q1 19? Is it going to 18? What's the time frame with which we consider someone's components of their program and practices?
We are looking for what you are doing right now. If something is changing, if you're in the process, we understand that this is always changing, and it's also it's helpful as somebody reviewing a submission to understand what's going on at the company and to see kind of the reality that the company is dealing with. So we allow you to explain if there's something you need to explain. If you want to say, you know, this is what we're doing right now, but in 1 month, this is what we will be doing, we're happy to take that into account. But we are looking for the current state at the time of submission. Some questions are going to ask you in the last 3 years, in the last 5 years. But generally speaking, we're asking for what the program looks like now and what the company is doing now. Any other questions that came in? I'm not cut out for the moment asking.
Clarification on the term like companies for the purposes of comparison?
Yeah, so that's getting harder and harder. I think companies used to fall into industry classifications more easily than they do now with a lot of the mergers and acquisitions going on. We look at size, we look at public versus private, we look at where you're doing business, and mainly we look at industry. If you're in an industry where we would expect to see a really strong ethics and compliance program, then we're going to be comparing you to other companies in a similar industry, so that we can understand if what you're doing is the base of what should be being done, or if you really stand out. So there's a lot of components that go into that: size, revenue, employee size, location, industry, type of company.
Yeah, that's right. Thanks, Michael. And one thing I'd add to this slide too, just philosophically, we get questions sometimes on why we make this change on an annual basis, or why do we review both the questionnaire and documentation components every year. And it's our attempt to make sure that what we're measuring, what we're capturing is both reflective of best practice, but also changes in recent regulations as well. We try to make this a process that is relevant and on the bleeding edge from both the regulatory perspective, but also in terms of what's best in class in our space as well. So while Michael had said a significant change occurred last year for the 2019 process, we feel that change was generally well received, and for this year we focused mostly on the clarification components of the both documentation component and the questionnaire as well.
So I had talked earlier about what you get, what the benefit of participating is, and I want to walk through how I think I mentioned that we had a lot of different modalities that we're trying to share the information back in. So participants will get a scorecard. That scorecard is going to have your score for each section that Neil walked through, and it's going to compare that to the average score of the companies that were selected for the World's Most Ethical Companies list. It's also going to have narrative and benchmarking. So it has some of our thoughts, because we learn every year, and we get data every year. And so we share that back with you through the scorecards. We also have a series of reports. We called them this year our Insights series. We had, I think, 3 reports, and we had webcasts that went along with those reports. And that's really us, once we have time to sort through all the data and everything that we've learned, to share back to the community. This is what we learned. This is what companies are doing. Sometimes it's us saying we thought companies would be doing this. It doesn't seem like they're doing it. We still think it's a good idea. And we also include other data points in those Insight series. So we gather a lot of information and data when we administer culture surveys for companies. And in doing that, we collect this data. And so the Insight series had some of that in it as well. So we're taking the data collected through the World's Most Ethical Company evaluation process, and then we're also combining that with data that we're seeing from other processes that we have, other surveys that we've done. And then finally, we have benchmarking calls that a company can specifically get on with us, where we go through how a company responded to the questions, and we will curate a report and a presentation for that company so that we can, it's an 1.5-hour conversation. We're going to get into the cost of all of this, I think maybe in the next slide. So the benchmarking, and we want to be really transparent about this, that is an additional cost. The Insight series, the scorecard, and other ways that we're sharing information back with you is included in your the administrative fee for all of this.
Thanks, Mike. I'll look at this as kind of a, well, okay, so you've learned a lot more about the WME process. You think you're about ready. What is it you should do first? And looking at that, we've again split this into 3 rough sections here. The first essentially is that you should confirm that your organization is eligible to enter the WME. We've opened it up so that any company, public or private, for-profit, not-for-profit, based anywhere in the world, is eligible to participate. That said, we have decided that not-for-profit colleges and universities, governments, governmental agencies, government majority-owned companies, And non-governmental organizations are currently not eligible to participate in WME, which, that's fine. Quite a lot of you here on the call belong in that first category here, the companies, public for private. We welcome a lot of diverse types of companies throughout the world, and we want to see those best practices. The second item you need to do is to look at and review the application materials. I cannot stress this enough. This is an incredibly important step before you start printing out that PDF of the survey and starting to go around and collect materials, is looking at, all of these materials here. If you're a previous honoree, your application materials have been sent to you automatically. That's fine. If you are viewing this live right now, if you signed up for this, we will send you a link to the form in a follow-up email after we're done here. If you are currently listening to this presentation as a recording, you can go register your organization at www.worldsmostethicalcompanies.com. On that website, you'll have all the links and all the information you need in order to get the application materials and figure out what all you will need in order to get started here. Last but absolutely not least is to review the frequently asked questions. We have taken a ton of time to anticipate and learn from a lot of the situations that have come up, and we've created an extensive FAQ list. You'll find that at www.worldsmostethicalcompanies.com/FAQs. I think we have a question essentially about the looking at the website. Essentially on that website, you'll find a lot of the information there, which will be, there are explainers around that so that you can take the necessary steps on your own to get everything registered. One thing I'll point out at the bottom of this slide here, we do have an email specifically set aside for your questions and your concerns. We are at wmeapplications@ethisphere.com. This will reach our team who can get back to you about your very specific questions, get you out of a jam if you're stuck on something. That's your resource here with the WME team. And this leads very well into this other slide for me, avoiding common application pitfalls. I know, having applied for this several times in the past couple of years, I've run afoul of a few of these pitfalls in the past. The cardinal one, the very first one, probably the best that Doug put up here, is to start early. Start early is probably the ringing cry I have heard over the past couple of years. Essentially, what we mean by start early is to make sure that you have found somebody who within your organization who can take on the task of organizing this, who can, within the near future or now, start to coordinate the process of finding out who has the answers within your organization, how you should answer all of the questions, how you should gather the documentation, how you should pay the fees, things like that. The sooner you do it, the more prepared you will be in advance of our November 8th deadline. The second item we've got on here is make use of the PDF version of the Ethics Quotient survey. In past years when I have filled this out, I have found it incredibly useful to be able to download the PDF version of the EQ survey, which you can find on www.worldsmostethicalcompanies.com, and use that to, oftentimes we see people print this out and they will take it around the company. They will print out certain sections and use that to solicit answers from the necessary people within your organization and to prepare your responses in advance of completing the online survey. Word of warning here. The practice we want to advise against is opening that online survey and attempting to answer all the questions right then and there as you're doing it. You may run into some technical difficulties with that. You may find yourself having to go back within an online survey and re-answer different parts of the thing. It makes a ton more sense simply to have the question set in front of you and answer it and make changes as necessary. And when you're sure you've got that final answer set in front of you, then to simply log on to the online survey and put in your answers in a very quick way. I can tell you it goes much, much faster on your end if you've already got the answers collected and sort of checked in on that PDF version. Another key item, take heed of the FAQ section on the WME website. If you're running up against something, more likely than not, somebody else has already come across that problem or that issue. It may be in our frequently asked questions. If it's not, give us an email at wmeapplications@ethisphere.com. Another key thing, which I mentioned a little bit before, it can be incredibly helpful to designate a single individual to own the survey and the application process. It may sound a little burdensome at times, but having that single point of contact can be incredibly refreshing so that people within your organization know whom to contact, and that person will be on top of it. It'll be on their mind during the period of time that you're soliciting those answers and soliciting responses. Lean on that documentation guidelines as you organize and prepare your submission. Keep that next to that copy of the survey you've got. Those documentation guidelines will be incredibly helpful in helping you not only find the right kind of documentation, but to format it in a way that our reviewers can quickly get through it and understand the points that you're trying to make, to allow our reviewers to see the leading practices that you have so that we can celebrate them. And if you've applied in the past and you haven't already, request a copy of your previous EQ survey results. Having those things available to you can greatly speed up the process. This is where you can take a look at your previous answers and see whether or not something's changed. It may allow you to recognize where you've gone to an answer in the past, and so you can get updated answers in the future. This leads into save a record of your application and materials for future years. This is incredibly valuable, especially if you want to use this not only for future applications, but for taking a look over how your organization has changed in the past couple of years, looking at your own practices a bit more critically. If you haven't had any way to sort of evaluate that, that can be an incredibly useful tool internally for your program. Again, I can't stress enough, if you have questions, if you have concerns, look at the FAQs. If you're really stuck on something, give us a shout at WME Applications.
And Neil, we had a couple questions come in about if we look at, I guess I wasn't clear enough on what time period we are evaluating. So while we think it's important for you to save your application and materials for future years, we don't look back. So each year, if you participate, this year and next year, or if you participated last year, we look at what you submit this year. We are not going to go pull the information from last year, and indeed we don't have it in terms of documentation. And so we are looking at what you submit this year. If you have, I'm just trying to clarify my previous answer, we're looking at your current state. If there's something that you are in the process of updating or improving, let's say you have a 2-year plan, explain that to us, but answer the questionnaire for the currently what you are doing now. Don't give yourselves credit for something that you will be implementing in 2021.
And to address one question that simply came in, it is possible to stop and save the questionnaire. I would not recommend it at all. I would use it as a last resort. Again, it's much, much easier to answer the questions on, say, a paper or a PDF version that we have available for you, and then input them into the online version once you're sure you have the time available and the answers in front of you to be able to fully fill it out at once.
Yeah, and part of the reason for that is there's skip logic in the questionnaire. And so if you go back and change a question, the questionnaire is just not designed to store your questions as you go. But to take your answers, or excuse me, store your information as you go. It's to take your answers once you know what they are.
All right. Let's see if this will go. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, fees. We've been getting a lot of questions on this, and I politely ignored them until we got to this slide. There is a $3,000 administrative fee. That fee is the same for every company. It does not matter anything else you're doing with Ethisphere. It doesn't matter. $3,000 is the administrative fee. That's the only fee that's required to participate. It's the same as it was last year. We really see that as covering our costs in the administration of the process. we have optional fees as well, and we want to be really, really transparent about this. We have, if you are included in the World's Most Ethical Companies list, we have an optional logo licensing fee. So you can go and tell the world that you've been included in this list. If you want to use Ethisphere's logo for that year, there is a licensing fee. So we're not charging somebody to go share and celebrate that they're on the list, but if they want to use our logo, then there's a fee for that. Also, the benchmarking services, so that's a professional service that we offer specific to each company. There's an additional fee for that too. We also, and I just wanted to address this, we've gotten some questions about if companies that spend money with us or if they pay to be on the list, and I want to be very clear, no, no. And that's the whole point of, I mean, I think this webcast shows that. This is a really thorough process. And the only fee that we require is the $3,000 administrative fee. Doug, I believe you've got the next slide. There you go.
Great, thank you very much, Michael. So we want to also notify the group in terms of important dates for this year as we enter into the 2020 application season. Of course, with today's webcast, we are now officially in the open application period for WME 2020. And this period will run until Friday, November 8th, as just before midnight, as Neil alluded to at the beginning of the presentation as well. Within that application period, this is when we'll work with you all in aggregating, collecting, and gathering your materials in preparation for that November 8th submission deadline. And essentially between mid-November and the end of January, the team is heads down in compiling, reviewing, and evaluating the materials provided during the application period. We work on that with a goal of providing a notification privately to all of those who apply during the first week of February. So again, this is a private notification, whether a company is designated as an honoree or a non-honoree. We'll notify them privately only at that time. With that, we then schedule a more formal public announcement of the recognition on typically the last week of February. So we essentially allow organizations to, for those who are recognized, to gather and prepare communication materials in preparation for that late February public announcement of our list for 2020. And then from there, we prepare for the celebration. The end of March this year, we'll be holding what's called our Gala Awards Dinner in New York City. And this is our evening event to really celebrate those who are recognized for the year. Involves guest speakers, an awards dinner. It's a great event. We hold it every year in roughly the same time frame. So we'll be planning on a March 31st Gala Awards Dinner celebration. And that is followed immediately by our 2-day Global Ethics Summit Conference in New York City as well. A 2-day summit involving C-level leaders, board of directors, compliance professionals, all elevating the conversation around business integrity. It's a great event and sort of follows very closely with that Gala Awards event at the end of March as well. Soon thereafter, analytical scorecards will be delivered, as well as benchmarking conversations will be taking place as well, similar to years past. So this is the approximate timeline we have laid out for the 2020 application season, and are excited to be engaging with you all throughout this time period as well.
Doug, we had a question come in. I'm just jumping in because it's my lack of clarity on the last slide. The logo licensing fee, there are 2 tiers. One is the general logo licensing. It's $10,000. It's a perpetual license. And then there's a second, there's a upper tier of fees if you would like to use it in television, broadcast television. So so generally it's a $10,000 fee, and then we would discuss the second tier if a company was interested in that. And then we also had a question of, do we have a breakdown of your benchmarking services? The benchmarking services generally consist of us selecting 25 to 30 data points, so 25 to 30 questions. That usually fills about an hour and a half of conversation. And we then put together a PowerPoint presentation that goes through for each of those data points and provides the benchmark, your company's response, and comparing that to what other companies are doing. And then the conversation is to put it all in context so that we're not just handing you numbers, we're telling you what we think goes behind those numbers. So
great. Yeah, there was another question that came in too from the group in terms of how this presentation can be received. It will be sent out, I believe, as part of a webcast recording at the end of today's presentation as well. So you'll all be given access to this presentation to keep for your own records as well as for your colleagues as well. Great.
So we have a few minutes. I don't know if we want to back up. There's some questions. It's hard to track all the questions as we go. One of the questions is, what do we do to notify the media of credible accusations? We don't see ourselves as some kind of investigatory entity. We're doing our evaluation so that we can, our research and evaluation so that we can go and evaluate the company. And Neil, are there more slides before I start going through all these questions?
No, Michael, this will be the last.
Okay.
Yeah.
And we do, as Michael did mention, we do have a few minutes left. There's several questions coming in now, but if you do have any other final questions as well, this will be the time to submit them before we wrap. Just a few short minutes as well.
And we've gotten some questions about specific questions that people think we should be asking. The process for us to add a question is, there's a lot of discussion. There's a lot of cooks in the kitchen. And like we addressed last year, we are in the process of considering all of those for next year. But this year we chose to really focus our efforts on clarifying the changes that we made last year.
Okay.
I'm just, oh, this is a good one. If the company submitting is a wholly owned subsidiary of a larger multinational parent company, do we consider the compliance, regulatory, and reputational concerns of the parent company when scoring? So this is one where I would suggest reaching out to us just so we fully understand the relationship of the companies, because it's not the question that was asked, but sometimes the questionnaire can get kind of tricky if you're not the parent company answering it. We will look at the reputational concerns of the whole family of companies. We will take into account that it's not that company, but if your parent company or your sister company has had significant issues, and we will definitely consider that. But that's something that I would reach out to us and discuss with us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great point, Michael. Thank you for flagging that. I do want to point out, we had a few comments come in through our question chat window as well. For those of you who have had a chance to apply in 2019, I would strongly recommend not only requesting a copy of your application from last year if you haven't already done so, but also take a look at those annotated versions of both the EQ survey and the documentation guidelines as well. We think it's going to be a great way to ease the application burden for those of you who have been through this before. So reference those resources. We think it will be a great experience for you for this year. And of course, myself, Neil, Michael, and the rest of the evaluation team are available for questions as you make your way through it as well.
And I think there's one more, I think I confused people. As you input your answers, it will be saved. Mm-hmm. It's just not, the process itself, we have had people run into problems if they are counting on the online intake to be recording their answers because of the skip logic. So I was just suggesting that it's more efficient to get all of your answers together first, but it will save your answers. You can log out and then log back in. I didn't want to make it sound more prehistoric.
Very good. Well, thank you, Mike. And we have hit the top of the hour. So I want to thank everyone online today for all of your great questions. Again, expect to receive some information from us regarding the application of 2020, including a copy of the survey, the documentation guidelines, and other information related to the fee and other logistics. And again, please reach out to the WME applications email inbox should you have any questions. Both this presentation and recording will be made available after the fact, so we welcome you to download a copy, share with your colleagues and stakeholders involved in assisting you with completing the application. And we very much look forward to receiving all of your information for the 2020 application year.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.